The sale bill gave it 6 words: fountain, iron, incomplete, A's is, where is. That was the whole of it. The hay elevator got a line and a half, the cream separator got its make and its year and the word good. Lot 44 got 6 words and a number, and on the last Saturday of April in 1978, 1,100 pounds of cast iron lay in 5 pieces on a pallet in the wet grass at the far edge of the Renner Farms equipment yard in Kell County, and the only thing that paid it any attention all morning was a crow that stood on the rim of the top bowl for the better part of an hour and then flew off. When Cliff Mebry finally worked his way down to it at 20 minutes past 2, he asked for $100 and got nothing at all. It was not a small thing. Laid out flat on the pallet, the way the Renner boys had stacked it with a loader, the largest section was a round trough as wide across as a kitchen table, deep enough to drink a horse, with a rolled rim and a rusted-through drain boss on one side. Then a plinth like a stone block, but hollow, cast in one piece with a scrolled foot. Then a fluted column the length of a man wrapped at the base in carved leaves. Then a shallow scalloped bowl with a crack running a third of the way across it. Then a broken bolt circle where something used to sit, and whatever it was gone. Set into the 4 corners of the plinth at about the height of a man's ankle were 4 small basins the size of soup plates. Not one person at that sale could tell you what they were for. Somebody said ashtrays and somebody else said flower cups, and a man from the hardware store said they had put them there to catch the splash, and everybody nodded. Because it sounded reasonable and nobody had a better answer. The bottom 8 inches of the plinth, the part that had spent 40 years in the ground, had gone soft. You could push a knife blade into it a 1/4 inch, and it came away gray and greasy like the graphite off a pencil. That frightened the 2 or 3 people who looked at it closely. It looks like rot, and it reads like rot, and in a way it is. Put cast iron in wet ground long enough and the iron leaches out of it and leaves the graphite flakes behind, holding the exact shape of the casting in something with no more strength than a dry sponge. So it sat there, too heavy to move without a truck, too broken to sell, too strange to want. Lot 44, Cliff Mabry said, the fountain. All 5 pieces, one money, buyer loads. Who will say 100? Nothing, 50 then. Somebody started at 50. Roy Taverner lifted his catalog without much interest. Roy ran the scrap yard out on the state road, and he had come for the woven wire and the tractor, and he did what a scrap man does, which is arithmetic. 1,100 pounds of cast, at what cast was bringing that spring, less the diesel and the loader time. 40, Roy said. 40 I've got. 50 anywhere. 50, 65. It came from down at the end of the row, from a lean old man in a flat cap and wire spectacles who had been on his knees beside that pallet on and off since 9:30 in the morning. The crowd turned to look the way a crowd always does. Cliff Mebry looked over his glasses. 65. $65 on the fountain. Anybody, nobody, the gavel came down on the tailgate with a flat knock, and Roy Taverner turned all the way around in the grass to see who had outbid him, and when he saw who it was, he laughed out loud. The way a man laughs when he is genuinely delighted and not being cruel about it. $65, he called out, grinning, one hand out toward the pallet. For a bird bath, you can't even plumb. Ansel, I'd have melted that for you free of charge. Ansel Prewitt did not answer him. He walked up to the clerk's table, counted out $65 in 5s, took the yellow paper tag with the lot number and the price written on it in pencil, and folded it into his shirt pocket. Then he went back and got down on the ground one more time at the end of the plinth and put his thumb into the carved leaves at the base of the column, feeling along the underside of the leaf tips where the sand would have had to break away. He was 73 years old, and he had been reading the backs of things his entire life. If you have gotten this far into Ansel Prewitt's story, take a second and hit subscribe, because the part I have been waiting to tell you starts right about here. Ansel had spent 41 years as a pattern maker, not a molder, not a foundryman, a pattern maker. He made the wooden originals that iron gets copied from, and it is one of those trades that has almost no monument to it. Because a pattern's whole job is to be rammed up in sand and then taken away again before the metal is ever poured. The casting is what people keep. The pattern goes back on a shelf in the loft, oiled, numbered, waiting for the next order that may or may not come. The first tool his master ever handed him was a ruler that lies on purpose. Iron shrinks as it cools, roughly 1/8 of an inch on every foot, so every pattern in the world has to be built deliberately oversize. And a pattern maker measures with a shrink rule, a rule with the error already baked into the marks. Ansel had said the same thing to every apprentice who ever came through the shop. You measure it wrong, so it comes out right. That is the whole trade in one sentence, and it took him about 6 years to understand what it actually meant. Otto Brand had taught him. Otto had come over as a young man and worked 44 years at a shop in Cranmore, and he had a way of doing carved foliage that Ansel had never seen anybody else take the trouble to do. The problem with leaves is that a leaf curls under, and a pattern that curls under will not draw out of the sand without tearing the mold. Most shops cheated it. They flattened the curl, or they let the parting line run straight through the middle of the leaf so it would pull in 2 halves, and if you know to look, you can see the seam in the finished iron. Right across the face of every leaf on the column, forever, Otto did it with loose pieces. He carved the leaf tips as separate little blocks, pinned so lightly they would stay behind in the sand when the main pattern was drawn, and then he would reach in and pick them out one at a time with a wire hook. It was slow, and it cost money, and almost nobody did it after the century turned. There were no seams in the leaves on that column. Ansel had run his thumb along 30 of them in the wet grass that morning, and every one of them curled under, clean, the way a real leaf does. So he bid $65 and let a man laugh at him and drove home. It took Denny Kubiak's boom truck and most of a Sunday to bring it up the ridge road. They laid it out on the barn floor in the order it had gone together, and once it was down and the chains were coiled, there was no room in the barn for anything else. Harrow Gap enjoyed itself considerably that spring. Down at the feed store they said Ansel Prewitt had bought himself a fountain and forgotten to buy the water. They said he had paid $65 for a hedgerow. Marge, his wife, who had been married to him for 49 years and had a fair idea how these things went, put a folding chair out in the barn for herself and stopped asking when he was coming in. He started at the bottom, which is what you do. Kerosene, a brass brush, a scraper ground down out of an old file, not a wire wheel, and not sandblasting. Because both of those take the crisp edge off a casting, and the crisp edge is the only thing that tells you anything. The first week gave him the plumbing, and the plumbing gave him the design. The column was hollow. The pipe had come up the middle of it from below through the plinth with flanged joints bolted from the inside, which is why there was not a visible fastener anywhere on the outside of the whole assembly. At the top of the column, the pipe split. One branch had fed a small bubbler head at the level of the upper bowl, chest high on a grown person. One branch had fed the big trough at exactly the height of a horse's mouth, and one branch, a quarter-inch line, had run down through the plinth and out to those 4 little basins at ankle height. Dogs, the upper bowl was for people, the trough was for horses, and the 4 small scalloped basins at the bottom were for dogs, and that arrangement is not decoration. It is a signature. Fountains built in 3 heights like that in the 1880s and 90s were almost always put up by the temperance societies, and the point of them was blunt and practical. A working man walking home past 4 saloons had nowhere else to get a drink of water, and so the women of these societies raised money by subscription and put a fountain in the square, usually as close to the saloon door as the town would let them build it. Man, horse, dog, nobody at the auction had understood the little basins because the animals they were meant for had been dead for 80 years. By the middle of May, Ansel had the plinth stripped on 3 sides. The 4th side, the one that had been lying face down on the pallet, took him 2 evenings, because 100 and some years of paint had built up in the letters and gone to a hard black scale, and there were letters cast right into the iron, 1.5 inches tall, and he had not known they were there. He brought the lamp down close and worked the kerosene into them with a rag and a wooden pick, and what came up out of the scale, 1 word at a time, was this: erected by the women of Verity, 1894. Ansel sat back on his heels in the sawdust and read it 3 times. He had assumed, the way everybody assumed, that the fountain had come out of Harrogap's own square, or out of Cranmore, or off the courthouse lawn at the county seat when they widened the street. Those were the places a fountain came from. He had spent 6 weeks quietly telling himself he had rescued a piece of somewhere he knew. There is no Verity. There has not been a Verity since before the war. Vera Stillwell ran the local history room at the Harrogap Library, which was 2 file cabinets, a map case, and a table, and she had it out for him in under 10 minutes. Verity had sat in the Ware Valley, 22 miles northwest on the flat where the Kettle River made its bend. 410 people at its best. A square, a grade school, 2 churches, a creamery, and a hotel with a porch. In 1934, the valley was condemned for the reservoir. The families were bought out at appraised value, which most of them thought was a joke, and given 2 years. The buildings came down or were burned where they stood. The graves were moved in a week, in the rain, and that week is the part the old people never would talk about afterward. In 1936, they closed the gates on the dam, and the water came up over the flat, and Verity stopped being a place and became a depth. The town's fixtures were sold off at the end, the way everything is sold off at the end. Vera had the list. School bell, $12. Church pews, by the foot. And most of the way down the page, in a clerk's hand, 1 iron fountain, town square, $8. A. Renner, Aldous Renner, had hauled it 22 miles behind a truck, stood it in his hedgerow as a stock waterer, run a pipe to it for a season or 2, and then let the line freeze and the cattle be watered somewhere else. It lay in that hedgerow for 42 years. And when Aldous Renner died at 91 and his family sold off the place, the fountain came out of the weeds on a loader and went onto a pallet and got 6 words on a sale bill. Ansel had not bought a piece of somewhere he knew. He had bought the last standing object of a town that was under 40 feet of water. He went back at the plinth differently after that. On the back of it, low, There was an oval cover plate he had taken for a mold repair, an access hatch about the size of 2 hands held by 6 square head bolts sunk in a bead of what turned out to be lead wool. Every one of the 6 was seized solid. He soaked them for 4 days. He heated them an inch at a time and let them cool and heated them again, which is the only honest way with old iron, because cast iron will crack if you rush it, and it will not weld back the way steel does. On the 4th night, working with a cheater bar and both hands, he got the first bolt to move about a degree, and then a little more, and then all at once. The last one came out on a Thursday evening in the middle of May. Behind the plate was the standpipe stub, a mud wasp's nest, 40 years of leaf litter, and, wedged in behind the pipe with 2 oak wedges driven in tight, something wrapped in oilcloth. It was a copper box about the size of a bread pan, soldered shut on all 4 seams. Ansel Prewitt did not open it that night. He put the plate back on loose and went in the house and told Marge, and then he called Vera Stillwell at 9:45 at night and apologized twice for the hour. They opened it Saturday morning on the kitchen table with Denny Kubiak's soldering iron and a great deal more care than was strictly necessary. Marge put a folded sheet down first. Vera brought cotton gloves from the library, which had been bought for a photograph collection and never used. The lid came up. The first thing on top was a photograph on stiff card. Dedication Day, June of 1894, and it is all there. A brass band with their hats off, 2 rows of women in white shirtwaists standing on the square with their hands folded. A crowd behind, wider than the frame. And the fountain, whole, painted a pale color, with water in all 3 tiers. And on top of the upper bowl, on the bolt circle that had been empty for as long as anybody had seen it, a standing crane in cast iron with its wings half open and its beak turned down, the water coming out of the beak. Under the photograph, folded in quarters, was the subscription roll. 117 names in one careful hand with the amount beside each. $11 from a hotel keeper, $5 from a doctor. $2, $1, 50 cents, 25 cents, and 11 separate people who had given 10 cents apiece and had their full names written out just as large as the doctor's. 91 of the 117 were women, in a place and a year where a great many of those women had no vote, no deed in their own name, and no reason to expect their name to be written down anywhere at all except a family Bible. Under the roll was a letter, signed Cordelia Marsh, Secretary, it explained, in the manner of a woman who expected to be read by strangers. What the fountain was for, and what the 3 heights were for, and it asked whoever opened the box to see that the water kept running. Under the letter was a cloth sack, and in the sack were 22 gold half-eagles, $5 pieces, dated no later than 1893. $110 in gold set aside as the keeping fund, so that the town would never have to argue about who paid to fix the fountain. It had been sealed in the base and never touched. Verity had gone under the water, still owing itself nothing, and laid on top of all of it, unsealed on paper that was obviously newer, in a different ink and a different hand, was 1 page added in 1936. It was a list of every family still living in Verity when the valley was condemned, and after each name where they had gone. Cranmore, Harrow Gap. 2 to Ohio. 1 to a daughter in the city. 4 with nothing written after them at all. At the bottom it said, and Vera read it out loud twice, because the first time her voice did not work properly, We are told the water will stand 40 feet over the square. We cannot take the fountain, and we would not leave the names in it alone, so we have written down where we all went, and we have put it back the way we found it, in case. It was signed Nell Marsh Hovey, Cordelia's daughter, 71 years old in 1936, who had stood on that square in a white shirtwaist as a young woman with her hands folded in the second row of the photograph, third from the left. Miriam Kessel came up from the city in June. She dealt in architectural iron and garden antiques, and she spent a long time on her knees in that barn, which Ansel appreciated more than anything she said. The pattern was from the Sperling Iron Works, a foundry that had burned in 1911 and had never recast its patterns, because the patterns burned too, up in the loft where patterns are always kept. 6 examples of that model were known to survive anywhere. 2 were incomplete. Complete ones, with the crane, had brought between $30,000 and $50,000 at the right sale, and the gold in the sack was worth several times its face and climbing, which left the crane, which had been gone for 40 years, and which Ansel had made his peace with, except that on the last Saturday in July, Roy Taverner came up the Ridge Road in a flatbed and backed it into the yard. Roy had bought Lot 45 that day in April. Assorted iron, 1 pallet, $12, which is the kind of lot a scrap man buys without looking because it is priced at less than the metal. It had been sitting in his yard since, behind the shear, waiting for a full load. He had read about all of this in the county paper. And chained down in the middle of his flatbed, with the rust bloomed orange all over it and one wingtip broken, was a cast iron crane with its beak turned down. Roy would not take money for it. He stood there with his hands in his pockets and looked at the barn floor for a while, and what he finally said was that he had been running a shear for 30 years, and it had never once occurred to him to wonder what any of it used to be. The cracked upper bowl was not welded. You cannot weld 100-year-old casting on a barn floor and expect it to live. Ansel stitched it, which is a real and very old repair. A line of overlapping holes drilled along the crack, threaded pins run in and cut off, then keys, little dumbbell-shaped inserts hammered across the crack at right angles to lock the 2 sides together. The whole seam dressed back flush. Done well, you have to know where it is to find it. They stood it up again on a Sunday in September on the overlook above the reservoir, on ground the water authority gave for nothing once somebody finally asked. The plinth went on a new concrete pad. The soft graphite foot was cut back and a sleeve set under it. The pipe was new, and the water came off the same line that fed the picnic ground. The bronze plate at the base carries 117 names at the same size in the order Cordelia Marsh wrote them, 10-cent subscribers and all. 200 and some people came. Most of them had never seen Verity. They stood on a grass bank above 40 feet of green water and watched a 73-year-old pattern maker in a flat cap open a valve. And the water came up the middle of the column and split 3 ways, and it ran out of the crane's beak into the upper bowl and over into the horse trough and down through the 1/4-inch line into 4 small basins at ankle height that had been dry since the year the gates closed. A dog got to those first. Nobody had planned that. It was somebody's brown dog off a leash, and it put its head down in the corner basin and drank, and that was the moment the crowd made a noise. Ansel Prewitt kept the yellow paper tag, $65, lot 44, in pencil. He said more than once afterward that he had not saved anything, that the thing had saved itself by being too heavy to melt and too odd to throw away, and that all he had done was get down on the ground and look at the bottom of it, which is where anybody could have looked. Nobody else had bothered. That was the whole of the secret. For 84 years, the names of 117 people, most of them women, and a town's word that had kept its promises, sat inside a hollow iron base in the weeds behind a hedgerow. 4 bolts and a little patience from anybody at all. He measured it wrong on purpose, the way he had been taught, and it came out right.